Hey, Dallas.
Hey, Craig.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Cannot complain.
That's good.
Day is almost over.
Oh, that's yeah. There you go. Good way to think about it, I guess.
Where are you again? You're up north, right? In Washington?
Yeah. So you're in Portland, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm kind of more, I guess, east, a little bit north. I'm in the College Place, Walla Walla area.
Okay.
So yeah, we're still like, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes from the Oregon border. So it's not too far north, but
Okay.
pretty far east. Yeah.
Yep. Hey, Steve.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Where are you located, Steve?
I'm just in the Denver metro area,
Okay.
just outside of Denver in the suburbs.
Okay.
Nice.
So it's the end of your day too.
Yep. Getting to it.
It's a good way to end the day, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Little socializing and not thinking about my broken tests.
Yeah, I'm right there with you on that one. So let's see, this week we're going over, I think, chapter 6 is what we're on. Method lookup and constant lookup. So there were a couple of points while I was reading this chapter, I was like, wait, what? How does it do that? But then they explained it later most of the time. But there was one that stuck with me, which was kind of an example near the end where like we'd included a module in a class, and then later we added a method to that module and it showed up for an instance of that class. But if we added another module or some other constant, then it did not show up. And I was kind of like, why make that choice? So I'm wondering if there's an object-oriented like design principle or something behind that, or if that's just a choice that was made and now we just live with it. Now that it's been that way for however long, like it would be weird to change it. So I don't know. Wondering if anybody else had any questions or insight about that.
I didn't try to explain it. I just thought it was weird, and it's a good gotcha to know, right? When you're writing code, that it's almost linked modules. The second one's not going to show up. That's just weird. I don't understand it.
Yeah. The whole like I guess acrobatics that Ruby does behind the scenes for superclasses and for all these modules and prepending modules, and how that all just stacks up to be essentially a superclass chain, but not the one that you would expect to find necessarily. So you kind of have to know what order things are being inserted in. I just found that really, really fascinating.
Sorry, someone probably should be taking notes. I don't think.
Oh yeah, thanks. I always forget to start that.
The prepend thing, it made me wonder if that was done in a reactive mode rather than being thought out. So the way the superclass chain does its lookups, I wonder if later on they said, oh, maybe it shouldn't be that way and we should find a way to circumvent that. So let's add in prepend later on so that you could then restructure the order without breaking anything.
Right.
Knowing that people have built it one way and then you're introducing a new way. So things like that make you wonder the origins.
Sorry, it was definitely like when it first was explaining how like modules are just inserted like as the superclass. Like at first I was like, oh, well now this all makes sense. I will understand, the precedence of my different methods that are getting overridden. But then it was like, oh yeah, by the way, don't forget about prepend and don't forget about all of these other things. So it's still not that easy to follow.
Yeah, but at least it gives you a method that if you wrote it with one understanding, you can fix it.
Right. Yeah, and the entire idea of when you get to constants and lexical scoping of just saying like they very nonchalantly said, by the way, there's a second tree. We've been looking at this tree the whole time, but there's another one too. which I thought like it's very cool how there's these two intertwined trees that you can follow to understand your definitions. But it was interesting how we hadn't like seen that yet.
Yeah, did you all get the example wrong? So when I read that first example, when they, I can't remember how it was structured.
Yeah.
When they were doing constant lookups, I figured it was going to go with the superclass first. But of course it didn't. And then they had to go explain, and I'm sure they knew what they were doing when they wrote the book. But that was, yeah, it made me scratch my head for a while.
Which one was that?
On the constant lookup, so let me go and find the example because I'm not describing it well at all.
Yeah, it's the number, what is it? 619, I think.
Example 6.
On page 157-ish. Or is that the right one? I don't recall.
I don't have page numbers since I'm doing Cloud Reader, but
yeah, likewise. Makes it hard.
Yeah. I paid $5 extra and got the book.
Nice.
I was like, if there's going to be diagrams, I might end up wanting.
Yeah,
example 619.
Yeah, okay.
That looks like it's correct.
Example 619. I gotta go find that now. How do I? There's got to be a way.
Yeah, that was one where I expected superclass to win.
Yes.
And it's something that I like. It's interesting that I don't pay attention to this when I'm writing Ruby. Like I'm aware of like when I'm in modules, but I don't realize that there's like modules as a namespace and then modules as a module, and they can exhibit different behaviors to an extent, kind of like how this example does.
Did you find it, Dallas?
I think so. So it's the one where they've got the namespace module and then some constant, and then the subclass, and then they're putting some constant. So yeah, so what were you guys saying about that? I'm trying to wrap my head around this again, see where I was in my frame of mind when I read through it.
So I was expecting it to pull from the superclass, the constant value from the superclass, because you're in the subclass at the time when it's trying to call it, but it actually calls it from the module scope.
Oh, so that, right, that lookup of scope first and then superclass second.
Yeah, actually, I think the actual example where they check that is, it's in experiment 6-2, so it's like a page or two ahead.
So hard to find things on the Kindle version. Oh, man. Anyway, I'll take your word for it, Steve. I'm having trouble finding it. But yeah, I remember that moment as well, like when they kind of showed how it looks up in the scope, because they're not necessarily superclasses or included, modules or anything. It's just a module scope, but still finds things there. And then it was like, the scope versus the superclass, which one's going to win? And I was like, I don't know. Like, that's the question I had. Like, which one would win? So I'm glad they went into that, because otherwise I would have been left with that question and had to go to try it in the code.
Well, and I do think one of the things that is interesting is like when I work in Ruby like this. So if you had, a module wrapped around a class, and then the class was going to call a constant from that parent module, I would still probably explicitly spell it all out. I would say module : something : constant.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I ever would have actually noticed that because I never rely on that sort of lexical scope inheritance, which maybe that's a pattern that's emerged because it can be confusing. It's
right.
just
right.
explicit.
Yeah, I think I've run into that a couple of times myself. And especially like, so I work a lot on sort of our experimentation framework. And so we have this notion of like in the lib directory, we have like GitLab directory and module, and then we have experimentation in there, and then experimentation has its own sort of experiment class, but then we also have an experiment model. So then it's like, which experiment do you mean? And so you have to be very explicit, like with the colon prefix and whatever to like get it at just the right one you want. So I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons that they're starting this push to namespace everything in our project.
Is that happening internally within GitLab, having a coding standard of namespacing everything?
Yeah, they just recently added a rubocop, and then kind of like everything got added to the current like excludes list or whatever for that rubocop. And so we're supposed to work through that list and like start namespacing every single class pretty much. Basically with like whatever domain it's under, as far as like GitLab, you know, work domains, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Or knowledge domains. So yeah, so it's kind of an interesting idea. Like one, it makes it a lot more clear when you're working in something, like what domain really sort of owns that, and so where you need to go if you want some expertise help on it.
Yeah.
But two, it probably reduces a lot of this kind of class name conflict,
Yeah.
where we have like two experiment classes, but now you'd actually have to be explicit, like I want the, you know, whatever one versus that one. But it might still need the double colons because it might still be under the same namespace, to be honest.
Yeah.
But that's all right.
What else?
Yeah, there was one part in, let's see, the sections where classes don't see submodules included later, which I guess is kind of the one we were just talking about. So, oh wait, so the one before that, sorry, classes see methods added to a module later. So the one where methods do show up. And at the very end of that, the sentence was like, no surprise here either. Ruby is one step ahead of us. And I was like, big surprise here. Like, I didn't expect that. What do you mean no surprises? So I'm glad they explained it later, but I was like, we're just going to leave that there with like, no surprises.
Yeah, because it's pointer based rather than an actual copy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're sharing the same method table, basically.
Right.
Which still kind of surprises me, I guess. And I don't quite understand if they're just sharing the method table or if they also share, I guess they don't share the constants table, right? That's kind of the point. But they definitely don't share the superclass inheritance because we've copied one and injected it in a different superclass hierarchy. So I guess that now makes a lot more sense why it doesn't see submodules included later. But yeah, it's interesting because I didn't really touch on the constants table, whether it's shared or not shared. So kind of intrigued by that now.
Found it interesting that internally Ruby implements modules as classes, and they basically just strip out portions of it. I wonder what the genesis of that was. Was it just easier for them to do it that way? Was that, clearly it has to be intentional after all these years that they left it that way, but I'm wondering what the original reasoning was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would speculate that like if the intent was everything as an object, then maybe that was just an easy way to say, well, we want these things that are like classes, but not, we want to make sure they're objects. So we'll just, you know, use our existing structure. But I would be curious, like, yeah, over the years, I wonder if there's been investigations into, you know, like the efficiency gains versus losses, if that were to be split out in any way.
Or if they've even addressed it, right?
Right.
Maybe it falls under the, well, that's the way it's always worked and you don't want to touch it.
I mean, it did make the whole method finding like very elegant, where it's just, oh, you reassign the super, and then now you have this never-ending chain for a very simple recursive call, which is very nice. It's just, we have multiple names for essentially the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that whole structure with the includes and the prepended modules and all of that, like I was imagining it like if somebody had actually, written a whole Ruby class hierarchy in those orders, people would look at that and be like, no, like that's not right. Like, your what was the is it professor class?
Mhm.
Should not be inheriting from your mathematician class. Like that's backwards. Like, this doesn't seem right.
It did keep bothering me that the way the diagrams were laid out was it would have like the class and then a super was pointing down, and like the super should be pointing up.
Yeah. Yeah. But I guess like he's just reverse introduction, I guess, of the tree. It's an upside down tree. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like pilots, right? To go up, they have to point their yoke down.
Well,
is that right?
I think at the beginning of the chapter, they even said the superclass should be considered the base of the tree. But then they
Yeah.
the top.
Gonna have to like, I think of it going up as well, but it's more like the base is here and then everything grows up out of it. So we're pointing down to get to supers, but
Yeah.
I guess it's just a mental.
Yeah, after a couple
Mental
pages, I
model
think
of-
I got used to it. But
Yeah.
So
That's a good
the
point.
majority of my career is in C++ and C#. And so,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
yeah,
I'm just
yeah, yeah.
kidding.
The language is fine. It's just you got to bring the whole framework along with it to get it to work, right?
Mm.
So I keep drawing parallels to those, like, okay, what was that in C# and trying to figure out all these things. And there's, in the upcoming chapter, there's a lot more parallels in 7, which I read last week instead of 5.
Okay.
But the whole namespacing thing is very familiar to me in C# to disambiguate, what you're actually pointing to when you call a variable. That's something that I'm familiar with. So it's been interesting to compare the two, and clearly C# and all the .NET languages and ASP.NET are newer than Ruby derivatives. So it's clear who stole from whom on a lot of these constructs. Because like ASP.NET MVC is basically just a rip off of Ruby on Rails. And I think they admitted that. I don't think they're trying to hide anything, but they are strikingly similar.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. And it's completely off topic, but one thing I like, there's one feature that I miss from ASP.NET MVC, and that's the global action filters. I don't know that Ruby has anything similar to that. Ruby on Rails has anything similar to that. So before you can wrap events around when actions execute. You can do before action, on action, after action. So like the common use case is global logging. So you can get like a centralized logging repository of everything that happens in your application. And I just don't know if Ruby on Rails has something similar.
yeah, I think, well, we have, I mean, the way you're describing it reminds me of like it's callback methods, which, so on Rails controllers, you can have like a before and an after and a, there's various versions of like before actions, and you can define a method to wrap around or before a controller action. And you can also do it with model validation. So you can do things before it saves or before after it saves, after it's
MVC
created.
has those model actions too. What was the other action you were referring to? What was the name of it? I'd like to look it up.
I think they're just referred to callbacks. Let me see if I can find it. There's active record callbacks, and then there's
abstract controller callbacks. Maybe it's active support callbacks.
Rails controllers.
Yeah.
Let's see, because it's part of action controller. They call them filters. So here's, I'll throw in the chat. This is what we have for controllers, and they call it, yeah, it's called filters, but it's always called a before action, which is like how we handle authentication a lot.
Okay.
And then for models, there is callbacks, which are kind of, it's the same idea, different name, different object that you're wrapping.
Yeah, .NET totally stole from filters too, because they do have built-in filters like authentication filter that you can just mark up with attributes, so it knows to go authenticate every single call that you mark with that basic authentication attribute, or if you want to create your own custom authentication attribution, you can.
And I know that there's like a mixed philosophy on specifically with the active record callbacks, whether or not they're a good idea, because it essentially kind of hides code and can create side effect type behavior. But they're all throughout GitLab's code. So
Well, thanks for the link. I was clearly, my Google keywords were not finding anything similar to this. So
yeah, it's one of those things I always forget the names, but those patterns do exist.
for the segue,
Yeah.
or the going off topic.
The what's it called? Deviation, I guess.
Yes, the side venture.
Yeah. Yeah. It's always good to have a nice side adventure.
I don't think I had anything else for this section.
Yeah, I can't think of anything else that we didn't really cover.
Yeah. It's all kind of mind blowing to me.
Yeah, it's actually, it was interesting. I was reading, this is another total side thing.
Nice.
I think I actually might have mentioned last time, like talking about design patterns. And I happened to read something about the adapter pattern, which I'd never, I mean, I never really am familiar with these patterns,
Yeah.
but it is the pattern that's used to create the, what do they call it? The ASP trees when you're creating a new language. So I think like in chapter 1 and chapter 2 here, it was like, you know, it goes and tokenizes every single word of code and then builds out this tree that will be compiled pretty much or parsed. And that is what the adapter pattern is, which I thought was very interesting. Like if you wanted to create a language or a custom style of language out of another existing language, that's what you would be using.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like I've read about some of those patterns multiple times and they just don't really stick because it's not like I'm thinking in patterns when I'm writing code. I'm just like,
well, most of them are built into Rails,
yeah,
so you never have to
too.
think about it. It's just already done.
It's there. That's a good point. Yeah.
I had a hard time with the original book because there weren't enough concrete implementations of it. And then I think it was Dot Factory is the name of the website. They had some really good implementation details in C# of all of the different patterns that were out there. So that became a good reference for me over and over when I was thinking about things. I don't know of a good one for Ruby languages though.
There is one specifically for Ruby. It's like design patterns in Ruby or something like that. But it is older, so I'm sure some of it's outdated. Like I mean, older being like maybe 10 years old, but it's in terms of Ruby, the language may have changed a bit since then.
There's a website as well.
Oh, really?
refactoring.guru/design-pattern/Ruby.
That's right. Look at that.
So those look a little bit more up to date.
There you go.
Yeah, I'll post that in the agenda doc.
Nice. Good find, Dallas.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
I was saying the wrong. What did I call the pattern?
Oh,
Yeah,
you
I was
said
calling it
adapter.
the wrong one. Yeah.
Oh.
It's interpreter.
Interpreter. Okay, that makes sense. You're interpreting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does make more
That's-
sense than the adapter.
Yeah. Yeah, the adapter. That's like. I think that's like if you have multiple connections to different database types, but you just want database.connect.
Yeah.
And you need
Right. So like active record is a
Yeah.
database adapter pattern. Makes sense. Yeah, so like learning patterns is one thing, and just sort of like understanding like what this pattern kind of is, maybe what it does, and having a code example that kind of shows it. But I feel like what brings it home to me is usually when you can find a refactor. So somebody started with something and then they used patterns to end up with something cleaner.
Yeah.
I feel like that usually connects a little bit better to me because I usually start with the something that's a mess. It's like, how do I transform this into something less messy? Yeah, so I think that just takes time with practicing the patterns till you understand like how they can clean up some things or how they can interact with each other to make things easier to follow.
There's continuing down the side adventure.
Yeah.
Having actually read these, and then later on while you're working on something, you're like, oh my God, that reminds me of that pattern. And then you got to run through all the
Nice.
patterns and you read them until, oh, that's how you do it. Because I remember I encountered a piece of code that had, 50 either case statements or if then statements. I'm like, oh my God, I read a pattern on this. I think, was it it's not catalog pattern, because I don't see that there, but basically you have a way to inspect it, and in C# it was reflection. You can inspect the interface to see what it does and say, oh, okay, it's of this type, go ahead and reflect out and do that work. So that all you need to know is the interface and how to execute on it, rather than, oh, if it's this class, do this. If it's this class, do this.
Yeah.
It's
That,
much
like,
more flexible.
Strategy maybe, or
Yeah,
template.
I think it is a strategy pattern.
Yeah, which that's also like in Rails you would have, because there's no interface strictly.
Yeah.
The interface is just, the methods that are defined in your class. It would just be like having 5 classes that all implement execute, which is what we have with services. And then, having a way for it to be like, as long as we have a way to execute whatever we're given, then we know what to do.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So even if it doesn't sink in while you're reading it, it is good to read those things because it may hit you later on. It's a knowledge bomb, right? It goes off later.
Yeah. Nice. That's great. Cool. Anything else for this week?
No. What's chapter 8?
Chapter 8
is how Ruby borrowed a decades-old idea from Lisp.
Oh yeah, sounds
that
interesting.
might be a big
Closures, blocks, closures, and lambdas and procs. Oh my.
I would recommend being prepared with some of chapter 8 because I read chapter 7. It's incredibly short and there's not a ton to it.
Oh, okay.
Chapter 6 was short.
Oh yeah, it does look short.
But it had 2 pieces of content, right? We had modules and constants. So chapter 8 is going to be like one of those. It's really, really short. So I'll probably read ahead on chapter 8 and see if I can wrap my head around what they're talking about and maybe be prepared, or we can find some other side adventures to talk about next week.
Sounds good. I'd be all for trying to play catch up to the EMEA people.
Yeah, I should have enough time to read a little bit extra.
But yeah, that's great. Good idea.
Yep.
I'll put a notice in the Slack channel and the GitLab issue. Let people know what we're up to.
Cool.
All right. We'll see you all next time.
Yeah, good seeing you guys.
Chat.
Bye.
Bye.